You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Presented by NiShacks.
Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I'm your co-host, Caroline Weaver, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, how you doing?
Hi, everyone.
Where are you calling in from?
Calling in from the Dominican Republic these days.
Nice. What have you been up to there?
Rented a car, so went to the interior of the island. Laying on the beach is not quite my thing, so a lot more fun to go to the inner parts of the island.
I think we've got different ideas of vacation, but I'm glad you're having a nice time. Well, what are the latest market updates that we should be aware of here?
Yeah, some of the latest things that are important to note. One is the continuing drop in oil prices. If you follow, for example, bunker fuel prices, you will have noticed that if you look at the low sulfur fuel, which most ships are using, it is now at a 4-year low. We haven't seen oil prices for bunker fuel this low since August of 21. And there was an announcement coming out here over the weekend that the expanded OPEC group are going to increase the oil production. So expectations are oil prices will go down even more in the coming months. So for anybody out there with bunker adjustment on their contracts, of course, it's not going to impact right now, but basically you should expect to see at least some smaller declines once you then get into your Q3 pricing. So that's one of the more pertinent points. Then, of course, we need to touch upon the trade war, as we always do. Fundamentally, there's been no rules change that we didn't know about. Of course, the de minimis was removed here over the weekend, which has caused an abrupt stop in a lot of air freight coming into the U.S., especially from China, but no surprises there. The surprise, and there's always surprise in trade war, is actually the one that came. I don't know whether it was Sunday evening U.S. time or Monday morning here, but here as of Monday morning, apparently the president wants to put 100% tariff on foreign movies. It is entirely unclear exactly how that is going to be implemented. Frankly, I think everybody's a little bit baffled about that one. I take it more from the perspective that we should continue to expect surprises in the trade war, and I take this as a sign that there is no immediate resolution around the corner for this trade war. We should also keep in mind, especially for everyone in the supply chain, we shouldn't act on, let's call them press headlines. The movie one here would be an example because sure, the president might have said that, but there is nothing tangible in terms of actual implementable legislation. And the reason I bring that one up is that by the end of last week, there was also an announcement from the president that anyone who bought oil from Iran would simply be banned from trading with the US. And given that China buys 90% of Iran's oil, this could be a huge deal. Mind you, other countries like United Arab Emirates also buy oil from Iran. But despite the president's statements, there is nothing tangible in terms of an executive order, nothing tangible in terms of a new entry on OFAC where you have all the sanctions. So an added complication to the trade war is there is right now an increasing discrepancy between what is even being said by the US administration and what is being done in terms of actual legislation. And of course, for anybody in the supply chain, it's the actual implementation of the law that matters, not necessarily what has been said politically in terms of ambition levels. So those ones are important too. Another one of the I was about to say recurrent crisis topics is, of course, the Red Sea. And I think it's important to note the developments we've had there over the last 24 hours. Now, from a shipping perspective, that hasn't really changed anything. Everybody's still going around. But the important element is that the Houthis were for once successful in getting a missile to impact by the Israeli Ben Gurion airport. There were a few people that were likely injured. That's not the point. The point is the Houthis, they've been shooting multiple missiles over months towards Israel. I think this is the first time we've seen a missile actually hit close to the airport. And of course, the Houthis are putting this out as a great propaganda victory. And what they're basically stating is this is the start of what they call an air blockade against Israel. Does that mean they can shut down all of Israel? Of course it does, and I see it in a different light. This is no different than what they have been doing to shipping in the Red Sea for a year and a half. They don't have to hit every single day. They don't even have to hit the airport itself. It is enough that the threat is sufficiently credible. We already, over the last 24 hours, have seen quite a number of airlines cancel flights to Ben Gurion Airport. Now, whether they will continue to cancel, just like we're seeing shipping lines go around or not, is of course completely open right now. We don't know that, but it is a ratcheting up of the crisis levels in the Red Sea. Obviously, and to absolutely no one's surprise, the Israeli government have already vowed that they're going to strike back, not just at the Houthis, but also at Iran at whatever indefinite time in the future. And again, this is where a potential ratcheting comes up because, as we've also spoken about before on this podcast, if not necessarily if Israel attacks Iran, but if US tends to go down that path as well, this increases the risk that the Strait of Hormuz becomes a conflict area. And that will have significant impact both on container shipping volumes to and from the major transshipment hubs in the Gulf, especially in Jebel Ali, but also on oil shipments and therefore on oil prices. So sadly, no new good news coming from the Red Sea. On the topic of the Red Sea, while we're down there, opposite, there's of course the port in Port Sudan. And I don't think anybody has paid much attention to Sudan. I was about to say for years, but sadly for decades. The reality is that there is a civil war going on in Sudan, has been for a couple of years, where the traditional government tends to hold control over Port Sudan. It has not really been embroiled in that civil war up until yesterday, where there was a successful drone attack from the opposing factions on the airport in Port Sudan. So as if we didn't have enough problems in the Red Sea, it appears that now crisis is encroaching on Port Sudan on the opposite side of the Red Sea as well. And staying with the world calamities, there is still extremely high tension between India and Pakistan, and we might be leaning towards a situation where shipping lines have to choose on their rotation whether they call Pakistani or Indian ports, and that is eventually going to lead to more transshipment to and from the major ports. And given the magnitude of volumes moving, this is likely going to impact Pakistani cargo more than it's going to impact Indian cargo. So that was a tour de force of all the unfortunate calamities that are out there.
All right, yeah, we've got a lot of conflicts brewing right now, it seems. Well, maybe let's talk about the impact on an actual supply chain. If you're a shipper, does this mean that it's going to be less reliable for you to get your cargo from point A to point B? Like all of these things that are happening, how worried should I be as a shipper?
Yeah, of course, everything is in context. How worried should you be? Well, if you have the belief that you can do just-in-time logistics and everything will be hunky-dory, obviously you should be exceedingly worried. In reality, I don't think any shippers are in that position. The only shippers who would think cargo comes on time in this industry would be shippers that have never ever shipped anything in this industry before, to be quite blunt. So of course everybody should not be that worried. But what I think is interesting is, and let's explore the topic for a while, this whole issue of what does a reliable supply chain mean? Now, if I'm a shipper, I would come at this and say, fine, a reliable supply chain obviously means that the cargo is delivered at the point of destination at the time I booked it for. And reliable might also mean that I would like this to happen like clockwork every single week. Now, how do we then go about measuring that? Because one thing is what our emotions tell us about what reliability is, but ideally we should be numbers driven. And this is where there is no good measure that captures it. And I would also venture to say that is not possible because reliability on this more subjective front is comprised of some very, very different elements. And let's try to unfold them. There are reliability reports out there. What they tend to do is measure the arrival time of the vessels. Now, let's get to the cargo later. Let's just stay on the vessels to start with. If you're going to measure whether a vessel arrives on time, now, first of all, that requires you have something to measure it against. So when was the vessel supposed to arrive? And here's already a methodological problem. The carriers tend to change their schedules. So the carrier might have a pro forma schedule saying, well, this is the vessel that's going to arrive in, let's just say, New York every Wednesday at 5 p.m. for the next 52 weeks. We can certainly measure against that. That is against the pro forma. But what if the carrier then 2 months in advance already tells everybody the arrival here is actually not going to be at that point. It's going to be Saturday at 8 a.m. Well, if they announced it 2 months before and before anybody ever booked cargo on it, then it would be more relevant to measure against that new timetable. But what if they then change that schedule 2 weeks before departure, 1 week before departure? What if they change the schedule en route? Because these schedules tend to change all the time. So here comes the next measurement point. When do you lock it in? And that's where there becomes some disagreement amongst some of the different providers of reliability numbers, some of the carriers out there in terms of how far in advance. Already there's an issue in measuring reliability, right? But at least that can then we lock it in, and then you can measure, fine, did the vessel then arrive on time? The next question then becomes, well, What if the vessel doesn't come at all? What if it's a blank sailing? A blank sailing is not included in reliability measurements at all. I know from a shipper perspective, it is an element of reliability, but conceptually, those are two fundamentally different things. If the vessel is cancelled, obviously I can't measure whether it then arrived on time or not because it never arrived. That question is meaningless. So you always have to keep blank sailings as a separate measurement, even though I was about to say from an emotional perspective, it's two different things. You can then, as a shipper, okay, so instead of waiting a week for the next departure, I can book with a completely different carrier on a completely different ship. So my cargo is now only 2 days late. But unless you then get the individual data from that shipper, you can argue, well, how do you then measure that? You can only measure the number of blank sailings, basically. Then there's an even bigger complication here. What if the vessel doesn't arrive, but the sailing is not blank? That happens when you have a port omission. So as a carrier, I might be heading in, let's say I'm going into Wilhelmshaven and then I'm going over to Hamburg afterwards. But Wilhelmshaven is horribly congested. So as a carrier, I'm going to skip Wilhelmshaven and just going to go to Hamburg. I'm actually arriving on time in Hamburg. Wonderful. So this schedule is 100% on time. But for all the cargo that was supposed to go off in Wilhelmshaven, how late are you? Again, are you going to be later? Maybe, maybe not. Because it might be that your cargo can be picked up by the truck that went to Wilhelmshaven instead of Hamburg and get there on the same time. It could also be the counterfactual. Would you rather come 1 day later into Hamburg or have the vessel wait 4 days out of Wilhelmshaven? So you have all these methodological issues that become enormously complicated. So that's why when we at headline form get reports from, for example, Sea Intelligence saying schedule reliability for right now for March, for example, it was a 90% for Gemini. It was, I believe, 75% for MSC, which are all very good improvement numbers. A lot of shippers will look at it and say, well, that doesn't apply to me. And I would tend to say both yes and no. We need to have a more nuanced view on this. I don't think anybody has ever claimed that vessel arrivals equals the same reliability as you see in your containers. However, it is still a very, very good proxy. Now, how good of a proxy is it? You can only really measure that if you also have access to actual data from an enormous amount of containers themselves. It's a number of years back, but at that point in time, I did actually for a while have access to basically millions of containers booked, or rather, 2 data points at the point of time when the container was booked, what was promised in terms of ultimate delivery time at point of destination. And then what was then also the information piece saying when was this container delivered, irrespective of how it was routed, irrespective of what happened along the way. And what it turned out was vessel reliability at port was very, very highly correlated with the reliability you also saw as a customer at the endpoint. It's not the same number. At that point in time, it seemed to be offset by roughly 10 percentage points. Whatever the reliability was on the vessels overall, what you saw on the containers was roughly 10 percentage points below that. But that's where, especially for shippers out there that are struggling at times, say, well, this reliability number is not the number I see. Fair enough. But that's not how you should then look at it. You should look at trends and say, the experience I have, does it actually correlate? Then you can always offset and get yourself a reasonable idea. So the whole notion of reliability has an enormous array of nuance, and lumping, for example, blank sailings and timeliness into one is simply methodologically possible. So you need to look at those ones in their own rights.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing that we're getting into this because there's a lot of talk right now about reliability and are we going to be able to get our stuff from point A to point B with all the news happening, all the current events. So it is important to have this nuanced take on it and take into account that the blank sailings are one thing. And we were talking before this too about the capacity fundamentally not changing all that much, even though we're seeing an increase in blank sailings. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, because I think it hasn't escaped anyone in the market that, of course, because of the trade war, there's now an enormous array of blank sailings coming into the US, especially on the Pacific. And this is again where nuance becomes important because what do you compare to? I was running some of the numbers here over the weekend, and if I look at all the services from Asia to North America, so all the Transpac services, both the East Coast and West Coast, and then I looked at what was planned at the end of March. So that's before the trade war started versus what do we see now? We have seen 90 blank sailings in total. I'm looking at April and May combined. 90 sailings are actually canceled. That is, of course, a substantial reduction in the number of planned sailings and can certainly be seen as a significant disruption.
Do you know what the total was supposed to be?
Roughly, you have about 60 to 70 sailings per week. So
Okay.
having 90 blank sailings over just these 8 weeks is actually very substantial indeed. But this is again where it becomes much more interesting because in reality, one thing is the disruption you get from a sailing not going. That's one level of disruption. But what happens to the amount of capacity offered out there? Because when I then look at the numbers and even drill further down, you'll find a peculiarity. Gemini, so Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, they have not blanked anything. There are no blank sailings, whereas Ocean Alliance account for a very large proportion of these blank sailings. Now, of course, Ocean Alliance also has more sailings, but the Gemini has nothing. Does that mean that there's no disruption? Again, depends on perspective. Yes, they still have their sailings, but they actually do reduce capacity. Now, how can they reduce capacity with zero blank sailings? Because they tend to then phase in other vessels that have slightly smaller capacity. So you can also change the vessels. When I look at MSC, I see a combination. They have some blank sailings, but the capacity reduction they have exceed the blankings themselves. So they have a combination of both some blank sailings and some smaller vessels come in instead of the ones that were originally planned. And you can then also look at it. If I look at Ocean Alliance, if I look at the end of March and look at where we are now, they have reduced capacity by something like 25%. That's a massive capacity drawdown. Now, the other alliances, Gemini or MSC combined with Zim or Premier Alliance, we can't really do a good comparison because they were only being phased in at that point. So that's an issue. So what I can do instead is look at what was the total capacity operated by everyone in April and May last year, and what do we see this year? Because when you hear the numbers, 90 blank sailings in April and May, that would be a huge capacity drawdown. Compared to last year in April and May, carriers are operating 4 to 5% less capacity. That's it. And that is not the impression you get from the headlines talking about all the blank sailings. And why do we have this? It appears like a discrepancy. In reality, it isn't. The reality is that when we look at the carriers' plans during March, before the trade war was kicked off, their plan was actually for a significant capacity increase compared to last year. Part of that virtue of a lot of the new alliance services that came in. Now, of course, that capacity increase has been reversed and is now a decrease. And that's why we end up in this seeming conundrum where, on one hand, yes, there is a massive amount of blank sailings, there are smaller ships coming in, but the year on year capacity development is not as disruptive as the headlines will lead anyone to believe, which just brings up yet another conundrum. If we have this massive drop in demand out of China, and if you listen to at least some of the carriers and forwarders, you're talking 30 to 50% drop in bookings. Yet year-on-year capacity is only down 4%. Something doesn't add up, especially not in the light that, yes, spot rates have been seeping, but they're not in an all-out collapse, at least not yet. From my book, something here is not adding up. I mean, the capacity we know to a very large degree of accuracy, simply a matter of looking at the named vessels that are de facto sailing. The capacity data, very, very solid. The demand data is the part that is not solid. We tend to only know that much with significant lag time. That's simply how the data are gathered. So this is where we know some of the stakeholders, Hapag, Evergreen, Flexport, Kühne & Nagel, have been now talking about these 30, 40, 50% declines. But that's out of China. We don't know how much it increased from the rest of Asia. So that's one on. In terms of the spot rates, we actually have plenty of data points out there. I mean, we have the NIFI index that we also talked about in our last podcast that shows some seeping of rates, yes, but not an all-out collapse. And all the other rate indices out there show the same pattern for right now, sidelining or only slight seeping. And we cannot have a situation where sustainably you have a massive drop in demand, not a matching drop in capacity, and freight rates that are just sidelining. In the next few weeks, something here is going to give. Either demand from non-China locations are much higher than anybody assumes, or freight rates is going to plummet quite soon. So because the numbers right now simply don't add up.
Do you know about other trade lanes outside of Trans-Pacific? Are we seeing a lot of capacity changes? Like, it makes sense that we're seeing a lot of blanks out of China or Trans-Pacific.
This is a good question, and I'm not going to answer it because I haven't run down those numbers. I've been busy here over the weekend looking at Transpac. So why don't you remind me when we do our podcast in a week from now? So we'll do that as a follow-up on market conditions, but it is a good question. Yes.
I have another question. Maybe you know this one. So for what you're talking about with the measurement of capacity, you're measuring blank sailings as the number of vessels that are not moving. Are there providers that show the number of TEU per week as capacity, like looking at what are the actual vessels that are meant to be sailing? How many containers can they
Yeah,
hold?
yeah. I mean, there are multiple providers out there that are providing that. I mean, there's Sea Intelligence doing it. There's Alpha Liner doing it. There's Linalytica doing it. There's EC doing it. There's a whole range of different providers out there. They tend to show more or less the same information. It's not quite the same. You can argue, why is it not exactly the same? Well, vessels that have departed, that would be the same information. But all of them process the information slightly differently in terms of what is coming in the next few weeks ahead, partly because a lot of the carriers are not really that good at updating their own information in terms of what are planned vessel sailing, say 2, 3, 4 weeks down the line. Some of them are announcing blank sailings on sheets they're sending to the customers, but their operational systems might only show this, for example, a week or two after. Some of them are more or less good at telling if they got extra loaders or when they change vessels in and out. So it's one of those where, whilst this is 2025, you would assume let's just set up an API and get the data automatically and everything will be hunky-dory. That is still not how this industry operates. In order to get good granular data, you actually need a substantial amount of also manual cleansing of the data that comes in. That's why when you look forward, you have all these data sources I mentioned. They're not necessarily 100% agreeing on the numbers, but the overall trends they absolutely do agree on.
The data problem is one that continues to plague our industry, huh?
Yes.
All right. Well, the last thing I wanted to talk about here is you've been in the States for about a week or so, maybe longer at this point. I don't know if you've noticed a difference in the news that you're hearing here versus when you're abroad in other countries. But what I've been finding is that it's a lot of, I don't want to say fear mongering, but it's a lot of like instilling this like almost panic. People are saying that, the supply chain is going to come to a halt, like you're not going to see vessels coming in from China. I wanted to talk about that with you a little bit because I think there's some concern about, there's going to be like shortages of things. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what types of items you might see shortages for, but is shipping actually coming to a full stop? Can you talk to us a little bit about this? Maybe reassure us.
I mean, first of all, that shipping is going to come to a stop. No, that's not true. And I don't think anybody actually believes. It is a figure of speech, right? If you have, let's say, you're used to having, I don't know, 20 ships come into a port a week, and suddenly there's only 10. That would certainly be characterized, if you want to describe it verbally, that this is falling off a cliff, right? Some might also say, oh my God, shipping is coming to an almost abrupt halt. You go from 20 to 10, but that doesn't mean it goes to zero. There's still ships coming in. There's still cargo going in. So whenever you hear that shipping is coming to a complete standstill, take that as a figure of speech and not the actual number. That's one thing that's important. The next thing is, what are the types of goods? Will we see shortages? Will you see some shortages? Well, this continues to some degree, yes. But the question is, what do we mean by shortages? First of all, let's be clear. This was also the case during the pandemic. The US produces most of its own food. We would then have a whole talk about, well, the rest of the world doesn't really want to buy US food, but no one is going to go starving. It's that simple. And just before anybody asks the question, yes, the US also makes most of its own toilet paper. So there's also not going to be an issue.
I have gotten some questions from my family on that one.
What you might see is more or less the same phenomenon as you saw during the pandemic, where, yes, you would see news flashes of somebody out filming empty shelves in a supermarket or Home Depot or whatever. But here's the thing. If you got 5,000 shelves in your store and 4 of them are empty, guess where that movie footage is going to come from? So what you could likely see, and we did see that during the pandemic as well. My usual go-to example is you go to, say, a Home Depot, and instead of choosing between 250 kitchen cabinets, there's 230, which I wouldn't necessarily regard as a humanitarian crisis. Sure, it does mean that there will be sporadic shortages. During the pandemic, we saw the same thing in Europe. Personal example is I went to IKEA to get some lids for some plastic containers. Lo and behold, I could get the containers, but not the lids. A few months later, they were there. It's that kind of situation. We're not there yet either. It seems that importers tend to have 4 to 8 weeks of inventory, give and take. And right now we are 4 weeks into this. Yes, I would think you are going to see press reports filming empty shelves because bad news sells. So those reports will be there, but they're going to be small and sporadic. You're not going to go hungry. You're not going to go without toilet paper.
Okay, good to know. Might have less choices, but it'll be a temporary problem. And
at
we'll
least with the way we tend to see the trade will evolve as it is right now. We can then hope that there is a resolution. And again, when we say trade war, the most pertinent part right now is the extremely high tariffs between US and China. If they disappear, this problem is going to somewhat disappear. If this persists, and if the reciprocal tariffs are put back in on July 9th, you're going to be in a different situation. At that point in time, yes, you will continue to have some of these sporadic shortages, and then goods will start to become imported again, but this is where you're then going to see the inflationary effects, because all the stuff that's going to run out of stock initially is the stuff likely that's going to be the most impacted by the tariffs. So that's where everybody's holding off importing. If this continues at some point in time, they're going to start importing it again, but that will obviously then be at the higher prices.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. That was really helpful. All right. I think it's time to wrap up today's episode. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back at it next week. So until then, have a great week.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by Nice Shacks. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Want to be a part of the show? Register to attend a live recording at the link below.